Well, welcome to the very first webinar series of Fundamentals of Descriptive Research, hosted by the Emergency Care Society of South Africa, part of the Research and Development Special Interest Group, here in the Western Cape, right here at Stellenbosch University. This is the first lecture part of a 5-part series aimed at anyone who's interested in research in South Africa and abroad. And this is all open source, as you can see, and helped together with Cape Peninsula University of Technology, OpenUCT, who is a department specializing in OER, Open Educational Resources, together with the Center for Evidence-Based Healthcare. We're proud to present to you the Fundamentals of Descriptive Research series. We will really be going about and describing to you what is some of the fundamentals that we need to know about descriptive research when it comes to analysis, data collection, data tools, write-up, and understanding how to phrase our questions of descriptive research and understand the paradigm from which descriptive research exists. Just like to say beforehand that this is a webinar, so there are people who are watching this online, currently live, and also in the audience. Hi audience. And it's also going to be made available afterwards at UCT's website, CPUT, and the Emergency Care Society website. If you want CPD points, we can have at least 5, then please go to the ECSSA website, log in if you're an ECSSA member, do the quick 10-point questionnaire on this lecture and this material, and get your free CPD certificate mailed to you via email as a PDF. So welcome again. My name is Michael McCall. I'm a researcher, part of the Biostatistics unit here at the Center for Evidence-Based Healthcare at Stellenbosch University. And my clinical background is that one of emergency care. So I was a paramedic back in the day. I was an emergency care practitioner. And so unwisely started to grow a beard. And with that, I was immediately kicked out of the emergency setting and became a researcher. I specialized in epidemiology and statistics, or biostatistics, and now I find myself working in an office from 8 to 5. I'm passionate about research in pre-hospital care and guideline development, and I do a lot of research synthesis. But today I'll be speaking to you about some fundamentals of descriptive research, and my plan is to take you through a couple of outcomes, and that is to discuss to make you understand why it is that descriptive research is so important, and also to make you understand what is descriptive research, what does it involve, what kind of designs would you be looking at, and also what kind of articles you might expect to represent when you look at descriptive research. Also, very importantly, I would like to go through what is answerable questions. So how do we generate answerable questions, and how do we link that with the appropriate study design? So it's all about creating the correct question for the right study design, not the study design for the right question. And then eventually, and as part of the Fundamentals of Descriptive Research lecture, the first part of the series, we'll just be placing descriptive research within the hierarchy of evidence and the lay of the land, as I like calling it. Also, please, you're welcome to tweet live during the event at ECSSA, and also at the Center for Evidence-Based Healthcare. If you have any comments or things you want to tell us, please just tweet. Also, you can visit us on our Facebook page, ECSSA, and also just visit us on our webpage, www.ecsa.org.za. So let's get started, and we're pretty much going to get started with why would we want to do descriptive research? So why descriptive research? Now, descriptive research is what most people like calling, it's often the first toe in the water, and that's T-O-E, in the water. And it's speaking about when you're wanting to do research. Very often we want to start off with these grand designs, these big trials, or answer very complex questions. But you really can't, because we don't have enough ground level information to even describe the problem. And thus, descriptive research comes in as a brilliant, probably the best tool to describing what is going on in practice. So if you want to change practice, you can say, okay, well, one thing might be better than the other, one intervention might be better than the other, and the design of that would be doing a big trial or something. But if you don't know what the problem is in the first place, if you can't describe the problem in the first place, then you're going to have a problem, and you definitely want to do a descriptive research to first describe that, and thus you're first putting the playing field out there. And so descriptive research is the first toe in the water, important to be for other studies to lead off that. So it serves as a building blocks for high level of research. Before you can do big cohort studies, before you can do big randomized trials, we need to have the groundwork done. It's like building a house. You can't start building a house without the foundation. You can't do the roof without having a solid foundation. And it's the same here. You need to have a solid foundation based on well-described problems or hypotheses, and for that we use descriptive research. It's also used in other healthcare settings and paradigms where, for example, it's very useful for healthcare planning, for when you want to look at trends, where you can do various descriptive designs over a period of time and kind of ascertain trends. So how do we know 2011 mortality statistics in EM, emergency medical care, differed from 2012 to 2013 to 2014? And also hypothesis generation. We can easily find out if there's associations between smoking and lung cancer if we can measure people who have lung cancer and see if they also smoked at a descriptive level at one point in time. And so descriptive research really builds the building blocks for future research because it can help us do a variety of things. The census that we have every year or every couple of years in South Africa is descriptive research. It's extremely valuable, and it helps with healthcare planning. It helps us to understand trends in socioeconomic status, education and employment, mortality, morbidity, and it helps us to generate hypotheses regarding some factors and associations between variables. And so we have had some good landmark studies that have been done at descriptive level recently in South Africa. And here's one by Sabua from, I think it's CPUT, where he's just following people, he's just looking at outcomes following pre-hospital airway management in TBI, severe traumatic brain injury. This is descriptive research, looking at people with traumatic brain injury and seeing what is their outcomes. Good descriptive research that enables us to look further into other studies. Here's another one by McCall et al. Looking at how long it takes people to receive their antibiotics once they've had a fracture. Descriptive study looking at all the people in the ED and seeing how long it actually took them to get their antibiotics from case notes. Very useful. We can then hypothesize about, maybe we should be using antibiotics in the pre-hospital setting to try and reduce incidence of infection. Here's another one by Wallace and colleagues about door-to-needle time for fibrinolytics or lysis for AMI, acute myocardial infarction in Cape Town. Also descriptive, describing the door-to-needle time. What is the door-to-needle time in South Africa when it comes to thrombolytics? Is it good? Is it bad? And making recommendations forward for future research. This is all the first toe in the water and very, very valuable indeed. So the next one is, if I were to search for it on the internet, on Google Scholar or PubMed, what kind of designs would be under the banner of descriptive research? Because descriptive research is quite a wide umbrella term. So it could typically be things like case studies or case series, where we are looking at a rare condition or interesting case and we're just describing the case. And this could also be not just a single case, but a case series, 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 cases that are all unique. We also have the classical design, which is called a cross-sectional study or prevalence studies, and that's a snapshot in time looking at the prevalence of a particular disease. What is the prevalence of open fractures in patients transported by emergency medical care services? And those are typically cross-sectional studies where they're comparing two groups or just looking at one group. We also have surveillance studies, and this is typically studies where we are describing points in time, but it's data is collected annually and continuously. For example, a registry in the ED, in the emergency department, where all trauma patients get put on the registry, and that could be then a very great source for surveillance studies. We also have correlational studies, where we just, at one point in time, looking at, all the people here have open fractures, and it's highly correlated with being in a motor vehicle accident with a mechanism of a speed of excess to of 100 km an hour. So there's a correlation between driving very, very fast and getting an open fracture. Correlation studies, and that's typically done through first steps through descriptive research. Descriptive research then as a fundamental concept. So what is descriptive research? What it is actually just looking at who, what, why, when, and where. It's trying to answer the 5 questions, the 5 W's. And yeah, there are actually 5 of them. So those are the 5 W's you want to answer if you're trying to do descriptive research, or at least for some of them, one of them you'd want to answer, and then you would be having a successful descriptive research study. Well, the next bit is we now know kind of what is descriptive research. You know, if we look at the literature, what we kind of can we suspect to find. We're looking at descriptive research. But as a researcher, as a student, or someone interested in research in descriptive paradigm, you'd want to ask yourself, okay, well, how do I go about doing descriptive research? And before you say, how do I go about doing descriptive research, it's important to note, well, let's first make an answerable question, because my question will define what kind of research I should be doing, what kind of design I should be following. So before I even get to creating an answerable question, which, trust me, as a biostatistician consulting every day with MEd students, this is the most important thing you can possibly be doing if you're going to embark on a research study, is trying to get an answerable question that's measurable and has clear outcomes and a well-defined population. That is probably the most difficult part of research, is getting a good question. So before we get to this good question, we need to first understand what the background to a possible question we wanted to ask. And the background can be ascertained through a literature review. And that is searching the literature for evidence to understand where the gap in the evidence might lie, where the gap in knowledge might lie. And from there, from understanding where the gap in the knowledge lies, we can then say, okay, great, what question can we generate to fill that gap, to add to knowledge, to generate more additional hypotheses, to answer hypotheses. And then we can create a question. And with creating the question, there shown by the question mark, we can then say, okay, well, great, what study design best answers that clinical question? So when creating questions, there's a certain framework, there's a certain method to creating answerable questions. And now originally, this format, called the PICO format for generating answerable questions, was used for clinical trials, where you always have some kind of intervention that you're assigning and some kind of control that you're comparing the intervention to. So the format of the question was trying to identify in your question the specific PICO elements, the question elements, which would be traditionally in the RCT setting, the population, the intervention, the comparator, and the outcome. So within your question, having 4 well-defined elements in them, where the I and the C is the intervention and the comparator. But that is not the right format for descriptive research, which is what we're focusing on today. When you're doing descriptive research, you're looking at identifying a population of interest, okay? Identifying the issue that you're looking at, because you're not assigning an intervention, you're not doing a trial, you're looking at an issue, and you're not specifically going to compare it to someone else, although you can have a comparator, but in this sense you can now define it either as a comparator or a context, and then measuring a specific outcome. And if you have a question with all these 4 elements embedded in it, then for all intents and purposes, you should have an answerable question, a question that's well defined, a question that you can say to people around the braai when you're having a braai, and they'll understand what's cooking, instead of going on for half an hour trying to describe to them what you're trying to do. The PICO will be able to do that for you in a couple of seconds. So let's go through an example of what a PICO looks like for descriptive research that involves identifying the population, the issue, the context, and the outcome. So here is a PICO example, and it's a question. And I want you to spend 5 minutes to find out what parts of the PICO can you identify in this question. So this question is, in patients with open fractures, what is the proportion of antibiotic administration delay? So if you are watching this at home or watching this recording, you can pause it now and do 2 things for me. Identify the PICO elements in that question and answer this. Is there anything lacking in this question? So you're welcome to pause it now. So thank you. And so for those let's identify the PICO elements. So here, patients with open fractures is the population. The outcome is the proportion of antibiotic administration delay. So it's a binary outcome. Proportion of antibiotic administration delay. It doesn't have all the PICO elements. And also, it's not that clear what the population actually is. Okay, yes, it's patients with open fractures, but is it patients in the pre-hospital setting? Is it patients in the in-hospital setting? Is it adults? Is it children? Is it animals? Who knows what it is? It doesn't involve an issue. It doesn't involve a context. And the outcome, okay, it's at least we know it's a proportion. But what is antibiotic administration delay? Is it a delay of 1 day, of 2 hours, of a week? We don't know. Might have two elements of the PICO question, but it's still very broad and non-specific. So let's try and upgrade this question. So I want you to pause it again, and obviously in the audience and online you can't do this now live, but if you're just looking at it, pause it and try and create a better PICO incorporating all the PICO elements. So here we go. This is my question. So what is the proportion of patients in KZN transported by emergency medical services who experience delay in IV antibiotic administration of more than 3 hours after an open fracture? So here we can definitely see there is the population and context. Patients in KZN and context transported by emergency medical services. The issue, who experienced delay in IV, and the outcome, intravenous antibiotic administration, which is defined as a delay of more than 3 hours. And oopsie, and then that we then see there we can see all the elements is now in the PICO element, and it's a far more answerable question. So when you're at a Brian, you're saying, "What? Cool, I know what I'm going to ask." Or Pity asks me, "Dude, what are you doing for your masters or your honors or whatever it is?" Well, listen, I'm looking at what is the proportion of patients in KZN who are transported by EMS who experience delay in IV administration of IV antibiotics if they have open fracture. There you go, done. It's not half an hour spiel about trying to make them understand your research question. And this helps you in the end to define your population, your inclusion-exclusion criteria, and what kind of measurements you should be taking. Because it's all embedded in the PICO question. So the PICO is truly an excellent way for you to set the groundwork and the foundation to do good research moving on in your career. So it's important that from the PICO we then decide, okay, great, this type of question I'm asking here is what kind of question? It's a question on prevalence. Okay? It's a question of frequency. Whereas if I were to ask, does IV antibiotics compared to tablet antibiotics reduce the incidence of infection in patients with open fractures? That's a question of intervention. Does the one intervention is better than the other? So the type of design we'd want to approach for that is different. So when we have identified the gap in knowledge, we've created an answerable question, and now we need to say, well, what is the appropriate design? So we have various question types. We've got questions about frequency, about etiology, about diagnostic accuracy questions, and questions about the effectiveness of interventions. And yes, this list is not exhaustive, but for now, this is just the 4 that we're dealing with, to make things simplistic. And so you need to identify, well, what kind of question have I asked? And the previous example is one of frequency. So what would be the best study design that would answer a frequency question? What is the best study design that would answer a question about etiology or risk factors? And what is the best design for diagnostic questions or the effectiveness of interventions? And the answer to that is a cross-sectional study or descriptive study is the best for frequency questions. A cohort or case control study is the best for etiology or risk factor questions. And then again, cross-sectional studies is the best for diagnostic questions. If you're looking about the effectiveness of diagnostic questions, then you need to do a randomized controlled trial, same as the last one, which is the effectiveness of interventions question, which is a randomized controlled trial. And so it doesn't start with study design and then an answerable question. No, it starts from question to appropriate study design. So before we even start about thinking about descriptive research, we need to find the question, define the question, and then look at the appropriate design that we're going to be looking at to answer that question. Good. So now, when it comes to knowing where we fit in, when it comes to if you're asking a question about frequency of or a descriptive question, what is the prevalence of TB in the Western Cape? It wouldn't help you going to go look on Google Scholar for randomized control trials, because they're not the best study design to answer that question. So when it comes to the hierarchy of evidence for frequency or descriptive questions, the best design to look for, to use, would be descriptive. And then you go down the hierarchy of evidence until, sorry for you, expert opinion, Mr. Professor in the white coat on ward rounds, is right at the bottom, because it all depends on what his opinion is based on. If his opinion is based on descriptive research for a descriptive question, then hey, that's good. Then he's got good opinion, and we can follow that. But if it's not based on a hierarchy of evidence for a specific question, then we've got a problem. So this would look differently for different questions. This is the hierarchy of evidence for descriptive questions. You also get a hierarchy of evidence for risk factors. You get a hierarchy of evidence for effectiveness of interventions questions, which we then would have randomized control trials being right at the bottom and descriptive research, randomized control trials being right at the top and descriptive research right at the bottom, just above expert opinion, of course. So it's important to note that the hierarchy of evidence may change depending on what kind of question you're asking. And that's an important concept we need to latch onto when we do appraisal and research methods. So descriptive research is right at the top here. Systematic reviews of descriptive research would even be the bestest of the best, right at the top of the hierarchy of evidence, but that's not so commonly done. I think it's now you find descriptive research in this little iceberg, but you might not necessarily understand the intricacies. What's the difference between descriptive research and cohort studies, and why is it so different? So I would like to just go through that as part of this fundamentals of descriptive research webinar, and that's speaking about the lay of the land of epidemiological study designs. And it pretty much would just be pretty much mapping out where descriptive research lies within this whole hierarchy of evidence and so forth, and what the differences are. How can you suss out the differences? So let's go through the lay of the land. And it's important to note that when you're looking at a study and you want to determine what kind of study it is, there's various questions you need to ask, and that's these question marks you see here. So the first question to ask is, well, does the study assign an intervention? Does it give something to me? Am I giving you something compared to not giving you something else? And if that's the case, then you are dichotomizing it between an experimental study and an observational study. Because in observational research, descriptive research by nature then, we don't assign anything. We just observe people. We do the 5 W's. We see what, why, when, what, where. But in experimental research, we're experimenting. We're seeing, well, what would the effect be if I give one thing to someone and not to the other? Would their outcomes differ? And that's, by definition, an experiment. So an experiment can then be divided into two furthermore categories. And the question to ask at the question mark there is, once you've identified it as being an experimental study, is to ask, well, how have they assigned these interventions that they're giving? Is the assignment through a random process? In other words, is there equal chance of each person receiving the intervention or the control, the comparator, or not? If it is through a random process, then it's called a randomized controlled trial. If it's not, it's called a non-randomized controlled trial, or just called a clinical trial. So that's important to note. There are also some trains of thought where a randomized control trial is actually where you have a random sample and then you randomize the random sample that you've taken to intervention and control. But there's blurring in that definition sometimes. So if it were to go to a randomized control trial and look at an example, and this would be the paramedic 2 trial. the adrenaline trial. So there's a lot of controversy about the efficacy of adrenaline because there's really a paucity of evidence regarding this. Well, does it really improve return of spontaneous circulation outcomes in people with cardiac arrest, specifically in the pre-hospital setting? So here they've done a trial. They've taken people who are in cardiac arrest, treated by paramedics, and they're saying you will be randomized to receive adrenaline or not. And they're measuring them up forward in time, and they're seeing, well, do the outcomes really differ regarding neurological outcomes, return of spontaneous circulation, and mortality? So that's the Paramedic 2 trial, the adrenaline trial, and it's great. And that's a good trial where they're testing the efficacy of an intervention, namely adrenaline. And another example, obviously, then would be if they would to not randomize them, then it would be a just normal clinical trial. And so that's an example of an experiment. So to come back, if we were to now say we're not assigning anything to people, then it would be an observational study, where we're just then not assigning, we're just observing people. And the question to ask is, once you've identified it to being an observational study, is whether you are comparing groups of people. If you're comparing groups, then you're going down the one tree. If you're not comparing groups, then per definition it's a descriptive study. And that is, ladies and gentlemen, where descriptive study lies within this paradigm, this lay of the land, is you're observing a group of people. And that's a descriptive study. There's also this thing called a cross-sectional study, which is also a form of a descriptive study. But a cross-sectional study, by definition, is looking at two or more groups, but there is some blurring in the definitions, some gray area. People say cross-sectional studies is descriptive studies and vice versa, and I don't like getting stuck up on that stuff, but they're probably right either way. But I like thinking of a cross-sectional study as comparing two groups, or specifically looking at the prevalence of disease and so forth. Either way, so descriptive research, an example would be this antibiotic study that you saw earlier, where they just wanted to look at the time delay of people with open fractures transported by EMS in receiving antibiotics. And they found, for example, it described that between X and X time, the median time from injury to antibiotics was 465 minutes, about 7.75 hours, and that more than 80%, basically just less than 80% of people have an antibiotic administration delay of more than 3 hours. And that's significant, so there's definitely a time frame for pre-hospital providers to give pre-hospital antibiotics. So that is a descriptive study. Now a cross-sectional study comparing groups, and this is where the grayness comes in, because even in a descriptive study you can compare groups. You just need to stratify by group, then you've got it by some important covariate or factor. So in cross-sectional studies you're also just able to do that. And here's a good study by Simpiwe, Swart and Deval, and they did a cross-sectional descriptive survey of pre-hospital on-scene time involving critical ill patients. And what they did is they looked at, they stratified people by qualification, so BLS, ILS and advanced, I think, and they looked at red coat patients, people who were severely injured. And they just looked at what is the on-scene time in minutes for those three strata. And as you can see in the box plots here, that the median time, the middle line, is all actually round about the same. There's some fluctuation, but overall it's actually all overlapping. The box plots all overlap. So I think they actually did a formal Kruskal-Wallis on this for non-parametric multiple comparisons, and they found there's no difference between these three groups. There's no difference in on-scene time between BLS, ILS and ALS for red coat patients, which is quite concerning. So why would a BLS be spending the same amount of time on scene as an ALS for a red coat patient? And so these are hypotheses that now can be generated and investigated further, associations, and a first toe in the water for research and further high-level research. Same as the previous study that was done on IV antibiotics. Good example of cross-sectional research. Then we have two other designs which are a bit more complex, and those are case control studies and cohort studies. Now let's start off with a cohort study. Now cohort study is fundamentally, now remember, comparing groups. So it's taking people who were exposed to something and those who were not exposed as your two groups and measuring them up forward in time to a predefined outcome. It's important to note that they don't have the outcome in the beginning, they only have the exposure, they're free of the outcome in the beginning, and you're measuring them forward in time. You see there the time goes to the specified outcome. Now, you can spend an entire day speaking about cohort studies and by virtue all the other studies that I've mentioned so far, but I'm giving you guys a very brief overview of these designs. So don't, if you want further reading, please just do contact the special interest group and we can get you in touch with the appropriate material. So an example of here would be, for example, following people up who were transported by emergency medical care services compared to people who were EMS on the ground compared to EMS HEMS, helicopter services. Exposure 1, exposure 2. Forward in time to mortality outcomes. That's a cohort study. It'll then easily be able to tell us about incidence rates, risk ratios, and so forth, of if you're more at risk of dying exposed to ground ambulance transport or air ambulance transport. So cohort studies are great for temporality, very expensive though, and very nice for single exposures, multiple outcome studies. Very good as part of the advantage of the study design. The other one is the case control study, and that is taking a cohort study and turning it upside down. It's starting off not with the exposure, it's starting off with the cases. So if I take the mouse here, you're starting off with a case, someone who has the outcome, who has died, or someone who has a disease and who does not have the disease, the controls, and looking backwards in time, looking backwards in time to what they were exposed to. Classic example is people with lung cancer and who do not have lung cancer, and looking backwards in time to see if whether they smoked, yes or no. Great for rare outcomes, great for you look at multiple exposures. If you want to not have the expense of cohort study, you can do a case control study and so forth, but it has its own limitations regarding inherent bias between groups. So, but the important thing is you're starting off with the outcome and you're looking backwards in time to the exposure. And that would be an overview of the observational side of the research. And that is, in a nutshell, then the lay of the land for epidemiological studies. And now we know where descriptive research lies within this paradigm. And it's important to know that, because when you're looking at question generation, you need to know what kind of studies you're looking at. So also, when it comes to appraisal of studies, I just mentioned the equatornetwork.org. Go to that site and there's a whole lot of tools available to you that you can access for free on critical appraisal and quality of reporting of epidemiological studies. Very important to look at. So that is an overview of what's happened regarding fundamentals for descriptive research. We've spoken about question generation, why descriptive research, what it is, hierarchy of evidence, question generation, and the lay of the land. And our next talk is going to be on the 25th of March on bias, error, and confounding in descriptive research, and it's going to be nice and practical. And we go through those important concepts of identifying these things that can influence our point estimates, other than just, what we think we're measuring. So do we know what we're measuring is actually the truth? So remember that two announcements, that if you are an ECSSA member, you can get 5 CPD points via the ECSSA website if you answer the 10-point questionnaires. Also, have a look at our biannual professional magazine called Sanguine. It's a professional magazine published biannually by the Emergency Care Society of Africa. We've got various articles, clinical articles, research articles, tips, news, CPD events, anything you want to know about the Emergency Care Society at the moment, and update yourself regarding information, please go visit the ECSSA website. And also, if you want to join the special interest group and form part of a community of practice, please do. It's for anyone interested in research, no matter who you are, where you're working, or what your qualification is. We want to get anyone and everyone involved. Please just email them over there, and please join us for our next online session on the 25th of March. Just a quick thank you to CPUT, the Center for Evidence-Based Healthcare here, Open UCT, and of course ECSSA. Please visit us, and thank you very much. That's all from my side for this lecture. Mike McCall signing off. Thank you so much. And I'll be taking questions online now, and also from our audience. So please do post. Unfortunately, this won't be in the video. Yes, so time for questions. Thank you.